The morning Louisa Lockhart opened her mouth at the altar, and every man within earshot turned and fled. The sky above Redemption Creek was the color of a bruise healing into gold. It had not started out as a morning anyone in Redemption Creek, Texas, would remember for anything other than the usual dust and heat, and the distant bawling of cattle being pushed up from the south pasture. It was 1882, and the town had seen its share of weddings, its share of funerals, and its considerable share of scandal. But nothing, not the bank robbery of '79, not the flood of '81, not even the time Reverend Platt had baptized himself drunk into the horse trough, had prepared Redemption Creek for Louisa Lockhart. She had come to town 6 weeks prior on the back of a mail coach, a single trunk lashed to the roof, and a carpetbag on her knee, wearing a dress the color of autumn leaves that had seen better seasons. She was 24 years old, with dark copper hair pinned so severely beneath a traveling bonnet that it seemed like a form of self-discipline, and eyes the precise shade of green that made men forget what they had just said, and sometimes what they had just thought. She carried herself with the kind of quiet steadiness that people sometimes mistook for coldness, until they were close enough to see that her hands were always slightly busy, fingers moving against her skirt or twisting a button, as though her mind was too full to stay still. She had come to marry Hector Brannigan. Hector Brannigan was 41 years old, owned the general store, 200 acres of decent grazing land east of town, and a reputation for being the most prosperous man in Redemption Creek who had not yet managed to keep a wife. His first wife, Clara, had passed of fever 3 years prior. His second courtship with a woman named Margaret Doss from San Antonio had ended when Margaret arrived, looked at Hector's house, looked at Hector, looked at the distance between his house and the nearest civilization, and climbed back onto the very coach she had arrived on. Margaret had not even removed her gloves. Hector had arranged for Louisa through a correspondence agency in St. Louis. They had exchanged 11 letters. Louisa's letters had been precise and honest in a way that Hector had found charming from a distance of 900 miles, the way a storm on the horizon can seem beautiful when you are safely indoors. She had written things like, "I do not believe in pretending to like things I do not like, and it seems to me a marriage built on polite fictions is a house built on sand." She had also written, "I have no skill with embroidery and no patience for women who pretend to have opinions they do not hold. I will be a faithful and hardworking wife, but I will not be a quiet one." Hector had read these letters and thought, "Good, a woman with backbone." He had not fully considered what backbone, in practice, actually sounded like. The wedding was set for the second Saturday in April. The entire town was invited, which in Redemption Creek meant 47 permanent residents, a handful of cowboys who were between drives and had nowhere better to be, and the Reverend Platt, who had remained mercifully sober for the occasion and smelled only faintly of something fermented. The church was small and white-painted, with a bell that had not worked since the clapper fell off in '78, and inside it smelled of candle wax and the particular brand of hope that tends to fill rooms where people gather to make promises they intend to keep. The women of Redemption Creek had decorated it with whatever wildflowers could be coaxed out of the Texas spring, which in this particular April meant mostly yellowed scrub, and one ambitious cluster of bluebonnets that Maybelle Hutchins had ridden 3 miles to collect. Louisa stood at the front of the church in a dress of ivory cotton, simple and well sewn because she had made it herself, and she was good with a needle, even if she disdained embroidery as decoration without purpose. She had let her copper hair down for the occasion, and it fell in waves past her shoulders, which caused 2 of the cowboys in the back pews to nudge each other with their elbows in a manner that was not entirely spiritual. Hector stood beside her in his good suit, which he had purchased in Austin 4 years ago and which had been let out twice since. Reverend Platt opened his Bible. He read the customary passages. He said the customary words. And then he arrived at the part of the ceremony where he asked, Does anyone present know of any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony? This was the moment that traditionally produced silence. A polite, comfortable, entirely expected silence, after which the ceremony would proceed, and everyone would eat the cake that Maybelle Hutchins had also contributed, a three-layer affair that leaned slightly to the left. Louisa spoke. She did not raise her hand like a schoolgirl. She did not hedge or stammer or couch her words in the softening language that women of 1882 were expected to deploy around difficult truths. She simply turned to face the congregation and said, in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of that small white church, "I believe I should say something honest." Hector turned to look at her with an expression that was trying to be amused and not quite succeeding. "Hector is a good man," Louisa continued, "and he has been generous and courteous to me in the 6 weeks I have been in this town. But I have come to understand in those 6 weeks that he wants a housekeeper and a hostess and someone to sit quietly across the supper table and agree with his opinions about cattle prices and the territorial governor. I am not able to be that person. I have tried to imagine being that person, and I cannot see her face. I think marrying Hector Brannigan would make us both miserable, and I think we both already know it. And I think the honest thing is to say so here rather than to discover it in 6 months when there is considerably more to untangle." The church was so quiet that the sound of a horse flicking its tail outside was distinctly audible. Reverend Platt's mouth was open. Hector's face had gone through several colors, settling finally on a dignified red that was not quite embarrassment and not quite anger but some honest mixture of the two. And then the men started leaving. It was not an organized exodus. It was not even precisely a running. But it had the quality of running, that particular briskness of men who have found themselves in the presence of something they do not know how to handle and have decided that the outdoors is safer. The cowboys from the back pew went first, muttering and ducking their hats. Then the Hutchins brothers, who farmed the acreage south of town and had come mostly for the cake. Then old Pete Carver, who ran the livery and had opinions about everything except, apparently, this. Then 3 more men whose names Louisa had not yet learned. They filed out with varying degrees of haste, some of them managing what might charitably be called a dignified retreat, but none of them lingering. Hector himself walked out, which was perhaps the most dignified thing he had done all morning, and Louisa respected him for it. He paused at the door, turned back, and said, "I will arrange for your trunk to remain at the boarding house until you decide what you mean to do," and then he left. The women stayed. Of course the women stayed. Reverend Platt stayed, though he looked as though he wished he had not, and one other person stayed. He was leaning against the far wall near the door, not in a pew because he had arrived late and had not wanted to disturb anyone by pushing through to a seat. He was 29 years old, which put him 5 years past Louisa and old enough to have learned the particular kind of stillness that comes from having seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. He was lean in the way that comes from work rather than shortage, with hands that showed the kind of wear that honest labor leaves on a person. He had dark hair in need of a cut and eyes the color of good coffee, steady and without apology. He wore the clothing of a working cowboy, trail-dusted and practical, with nothing about him that suggested he was particularly prosperous or particularly important. He had not run. He was the only man in that church who had not run. Louisa noticed him the way you notice a fixed point in a spinning room, not because he was doing anything remarkable, but because he was not doing the remarkable thing that everyone else was doing. She met his eyes across the emptied church, and he held her gaze with what she would later describe to Maybelle Hutchins as the expression of a man who found something interesting and was deciding whether to be smart enough to say so. He pushed off from the wall. He walked down the aisle, not hurrying, his boots quiet on the wooden floor. He stopped 4 feet from her, which was close enough to speak normally and far enough to be respectful of a woman who had just done something that took considerable nerve. "I'm Isaac Quinn," he said. I work the Verla Ranch east of here, been there going on 2 years now. He paused. I was wondering if you'd be willing to continue. Louisa stared at him. Continue what? Talking, Isaac Quinn said. You were saying something honest. Most people don't, and when they do, other people tend to run. I've noticed that, but I find I'd rather stay and hear the rest. Louisa looked at this man for a long moment. Behind her, Reverend Platt was making a quiet exit of his own, clearly deciding that whatever was happening now was above his particular professional capacity. The women were murmuring to each other with the particular frequency of women who will have a great deal to discuss for the next several weeks. The rest, Louisa said slowly. What makes you think there is a rest? Because, Isaac Quinn said, a woman who can say all of that in front of a church full of people has got considerably more to say, and I think you've been waiting a good while for someone to ask. Louisa opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at him with an expression that she could not quite identify herself, something between suspicion and an emotion she had not felt in long enough that she had nearly stopped expecting it. All right, she said, but not here. I think this church has had enough of me for one morning. Isaac Quinn smiled, and it was the kind of smile that rearranged something small but significant in the architecture of Louisa Lockhart's carefully ordered interior world. There's a bench outside the Mercantile, he said. It's got a decent view of the street. Nobody'll bother us. You don't know that, Louisa said. The whole town is out there watching. Yeah, Isaac agreed cheerfully. But they're mostly going to be looking at each other and not at us. People are real self-involved right after something surprising. It's a good time to have a conversation. Louisa picked up her carpetbag from beside the first pew, smoothed the front of her ivory dress with a hand that was steadier than she felt, and said, "Lead the way, Mr. Quinn." He did. The bench outside Carmichael's Mercantile was, as promised, in a good position relative to the general commotion of Redemption Creek's morning. The town had the look of a place that had swallowed something it could not quite digest. Men were gathered in clusters, and even from across the street Louisa could see them speaking with the particular energy of people processing a shock. Women were coming out of the church in ones and twos, and several of them glanced toward the bench with expressions that ranged from scandalized to openly admiring. Louisa sat. Isaac sat beside her, leaving a proper distance between them, and stretched his legs out in front of him with the ease of a man comfortable in his own body. "So," he said, "how long have you known that it wasn't right?" Louisa set her carpetbag between her feet and looked out at the street. "About 3 weeks in. Hector took me to dinner at the hotel. That was meant to be one of our getting acquainted evenings, and he spent the better part of an hour explaining to me why the women in this town needed to organize a proper ladies' auxiliary, which is well and good. But when I said that the ladies' auxiliary would probably do better if it had an actual purpose beyond decorating the church and discussing recipes, he looked at me the way men look at horses that have just done something unexpected and not in a welcome way. Isaac considered this. That bad? It was the look, Louisa said. Not the words. The look was the thing. It was the look of a man who had decided in advance what sort of woman he was getting, and was only at that moment beginning to understand that the advance decision had been wrong. She paused. "I know what I am, Mr. Quinn. I have always known. My mother called it stubbornness, and my schoolteacher called it opinionated, and my father, who was the most honest of the three, called it the family curse, by which he meant the family gift, because he had it too, and it made him very unpopular and very rarely wrong." Isaac was quiet for a moment. Around them, the town moved and buzzed. A dog trotted past with enormous purpose, disappearing around the corner of the livery. The April sun was warming toward its midday height, and the air smelled of dust and possibility. "Where's your father now?" Isaac asked. "He died in '79, Louisa said. "Influenza. My mother had gone 2 years before that, the same illness. I have a brother in Kansas City who writes 3 times a year and means well and is thoroughly comfortable with his comfortable life." She said this without bitterness, simply as a statement of existing fact. "The house we owned in Missouri was sold to cover the debts. I was working in a millinery shop in St. Louis when I answered Hector's advertisement. A millinery shop, Isaac repeated. Is that how you learned to make hats you didn't want to make? Louisa glanced at him sharply, then realized her expression had given her away. I spent 2 years making hats, she said. I do not have strong feelings about hats. That's not what your face said. She turned to look at him more fully and found that he was watching her with a careful attention that was not unkind, the attention of someone who was genuinely trying to understand what they were seeing rather than fit it into a category they had already prepared. It made her uncomfortable in the way that honesty received, as opposed to honesty given, always made her uncomfortable. I dislike unnecessary decoration, she said. On hats, on furniture, on people. I think a thing should be what it is and do what it's meant to do. That's a useful philosophy out here, Isaac said. Where are you from, Mr. Quinn? Louisa asked. Originally. Arkansas, he said. Small place called Denton's Mill that probably isn't even on any map you've ever looked at. My father had a farm. I left when I was 18 because there wasn't enough of it for 3 sons and I was the middle one and the most mobile. He said this with a lightness that did not quite cover everything beneath it. Spent a couple years doing various things I don't recommend, then drifted into cattle work and found I was good at it, so I stayed. Various things you don't recommend, Louisa said. That's an interesting phrase. I was young and foolish and occasionally hungry, Isaac said simply. I made choices I wouldn't make now. But I didn't kill anyone and I didn't steal from anyone who couldn't afford it, and that's the best I can say for that period. Louisa absorbed this. She appreciated that he had not pretended the various things were respectable, and she appreciated equally that he had not made a performance of confessing them. It was the exact middle ground between dishonesty and drama, and it was, she realized, a kind of honesty she did not often encounter. What made you stay for the rest? She asked. Most men ran so fast I believe some of them are still running. Isaac thought about this with a seriousness she had not expected. He looked at his own hands for a moment, those work-worn hands, and then back out at the street. My mother, he said, was the kind of woman who always said what she thought and spent her entire life apologizing for it afterward. Not because she thought she was wrong, but because she'd learned that saying what you think costs something, and she was always paying the cost and feeling guilty about the payment. I used to think, when I was young, that she'd be happier if she just stopped saying things. But I grew up and I realized that wasn't right. The things she said were the best things about her. The world just didn't have room for them. He paused. I guess I stayed because I wanted to see what happens when someone says the true thing and doesn't apologize for it. I've been waiting to see that my whole life. The two of them sat with that for a moment. Something had shifted in the air between them. Not dramatically, not in the way that stories sometimes describe these moments, with sudden clarity or hearts hammering or any of the more theatrical signals. It was quieter than that. It was the particular shift of two people who have, almost without noticing, revealed something real to each other and are now standing in the changed landscape that follows. Mr. Quinn, Louisa said at last, are you employed today or do you have the morning free? The boys gave me the day off for the wedding, Isaac said. I'm not expected back until tomorrow. In that case, Louisa said, I wonder if you would be willing to walk with me. I have been in this town 6 weeks and I have spent most of them in Hector's company, or in the company of women who were being very kind and very careful around me, and I would like to see the country around here without feeling that I am being managed. Isaac stood. He held out his hand to help her up from the bench, and she took it, and they both noted, without commenting on it, that neither of them let go quite as quickly as strict courtesy required. They walked east out of town along the road that followed Redemption Creek itself, the small brown river that had given the town its name and provided its only reliable source of water. The creek ran between banks of cottonwood and willow that were just beginning to leaf out in the faint green of early spring, and the sound of the water running over its rocky bed was the cleanest sound in the county. Isaac walked beside her without talking, which she appreciated, and without the self-conscious silence of a man who felt he ought to be talking, which she appreciated even more. They walked for perhaps a quarter-mile before she said, "Tell me about the Verla ranch." "It belongs to Eduardo Verla," Isaac said. "He came up from Sonora in '64 with 140 pesos, a good horse, and a clear idea of what he wanted. Built the whole thing from scratch. He's got about 3,000 acres now, runs a good-sized herd and runs them honestly." He paused. "He's one of the best men I've ever worked for. Fair wages, fair treatment, doesn't pretend the work is anything other than what it is." "Is that rare?" Louisa asked. "Fair wages and fair treatment, out here?" Isaac gave her a sideways look that contained a great deal. "Some outfits are good, some aren't. I've worked for some that weren't, and I learned enough from the experience to know the difference." Louisa thought about Maybelle Hutchins, who had mentioned the Verla ranch in passing with a slight tightening around her mouth that suggested opinions she had not shared. "Some people in town don't seem enthusiastic about the Verla family," she said carefully. Isaac's jaw tightened briefly. "Some people in this town have opinions about Eduardo Verla and his family that are based on where he was born rather than who he is," he said. "And those people are wrong, and I say so when they say it in front of me, which makes me somewhat unpopular in certain quarters. But you say it anyway." "I say it anyway." Louisa stopped walking. She turned to look at him fully, standing there in the April morning with the creek sounds and the cottonwood buds and the wide Texas sky behind him, and she thought, "There you are. I have been looking for the shape of a person like you, and here you are in the last place I expected, on the worst morning of my carefully planned practical life, and this is not convenient at all." She did not say any of that. She was honest, but she was not reckless. "I think," she said instead, "that I should like to meet the Verlas." Isaac looked slightly surprised. "Today? Is that a problem?" "No," he said slowly, a smile finding its way onto his face. "No, I think Eduardo would find you very interesting. His wife, Rosa, would either love you immediately or you'd scare her to death. I'm honestly not sure which." "I've never scared a woman to death," Louisa said. "I have made several very uncomfortable, but that's different." Isaac laughed, and it was a full and genuine laugh that startled a bird from the cottonwood above them into indignant flight. And Louisa felt something inside her chest do a small and completely unauthorized thing that she elected to ignore for the time being. They did not go to the Verla ranch that day, as it turned out, because as they turned back toward town, they encountered Maybelle Hutchins coming down the road at an urgent pace with her skirts gathered up and an expression of determined helpfulness on her face. "Louisa," she said with only a brief and carefully neutral glance at Isaac, "you ought to come have some dinner. I've got enough for 3 if Mr. Quinn would like to join." Isaac looked at Louisa. Louisa looked at Maybelle. "That's very kind," Louisa said. "We'll come." Maybelle Hutchins was 43 years old, had been a widow for 7 years, and had developed in those 7 years a philosophy of life that was essentially pragmatic. She ran the boarding house where Louisa was staying, kept a kitchen that turned out consistently good food, and had a way of sitting at her own table that made it feel like the exact center of the universe. She was, Louisa had decided in their 6 weeks of acquaintance, one of the finest people she had ever met, in the way that a good practical tool is one of the finest things, valuable precisely because it does exactly what it is supposed to do with no pretense about being anything else. Over chicken stew and cornbread, and the excellent coffee that Maybelle produced from a battered pot on the stove, Louisa told the full story of the morning. She did not soften it or dramatize it. She said that she was sorry for any embarrassment the situation had caused Hector, who was fundamentally a decent man, and that she hoped the town would extend him the same charity it presumably extended to any man who had been disappointed, and that she herself did not plan to skulk about in shame, but intended to remain in Redemption Creek for the time being, as she had no immediate means of going elsewhere and no particular desire to. Maybelle listened to all of this over her coffee cup, with the expression of someone who is hearing confirmation of something they had already suspected. "I'll tell you what I told Hector when he came around last week," Maybelle said, "because he did come around, asking my opinion of you, though he didn't say that's what he was asking. I told him you were the most genuinely honest person I had met in 20 years of running a boarding house, which is saying something because boarding houses tend to attract the full variety. And I told him that was either the best thing or the worst thing for him, depending on who he actually was, and that only he could know which. What did he say? Louisa asked. He said he appreciated my candor, Maybelle said, and then he changed the subject to cattle prices, which told me everything I needed to know. Isaac, who had been eating his stew with the steady focus of a man who had learned not to miss meals when they were offered, looked up at this and caught Louisa's eye, and they shared a small, quiet look of mutual understanding that Maybelle observed with the practiced invisibility of a woman who had been running a boarding house for 20 years and had seen every variety of human beginning. In the days that followed, Redemption Creek settled into its adjusted understanding of events, the way towns do, converting the scandal into the story and the story into something that could be discussed over fences and at the general store without anyone involved having to be present. Hector Brannigan was civil to Louisa when they passed on the street, with a slightly stiff civility that she respected, and she was equally civil to him, and within a week they had reached the kind of quiet mutual acceptance that is available to two intelligent people who wish each other no particular harm and simply need to share a small town. Louisa, who had no money and no immediate prospects, had a conversation with Maybelle that was brief and direct, and ended with Louisa taking over the boarding house laundry in exchange for her room and board. She also offered to help in the kitchen, which Maybelle accepted with the caveat that Louisa follow Maybelle's particular system, which was elaborate and particular, and made a great deal of sense once you understood it. Isaac Quinn came back to town the following Thursday. He came ostensibly to pick up a supply order for the Verla Ranch, which was true but not the complete picture. He tied his horse at the mercantile and collected the order, and then walked the 3 blocks to Maybelle's boarding house, with the supply list folded in his pocket, and knocked at the front door. Louisa answered it herself because Maybelle was in the kitchen and the other 2 boarders, a traveling surveyor and a retired schoolteacher named Mr. Finch, were both out. She was wearing a practical dress the color of pine trees and her hair was braided back, and she had flour on her hands because she had been helping with the biscuits, and she looked like exactly what she was, a woman in the middle of a working morning who had not been expecting visitors. "Mr. Quinn," she said. "Miss Lockhart," he said. He held up a paper bag. "I brought coffee beans from the Verla Ranch. Rosa grows them special. She says your boarding house has better coffee than the hotel and she wanted you to have good material to work with." Louisa stared at him. "Rosa Verla said that. I may have told her when I went back Sunday that I'd had coffee at Maybelle's that was worth the 20-mile ride," Isaac said. "Rosa is competitive about coffee. You told the Verlas about me." "Eduardo asked how the wedding went," Isaac said simply. "I told him honestly. He said you sounded like someone worth knowing." Rosa said to bring coffee. Louisa stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I'll make us a cup, since apparently my reputation now rests on it." They sat in Maybelle's front parlor, which was a room of faded comfort and practical furniture, and drank coffee that was indeed extraordinary, and Louisa asked Isaac about the Verla operation in enough specific detail that it was clear she was genuinely curious about the workings of a cattle ranch, and Isaac answered in enough specific detail that it was clear he was genuinely pleased to be asked. "Would you like to see it?" he said eventually. "I could ask Eduardo. He gives tours sometimes." "Well, he doesn't call them tour. He just shows people around because he's proud of the place, which he should be." "I would like that very much," Louisa said. Saturday, she agreed. He stood to go and she walked him to the door, and at the threshold he turned back and said, "Miss Lockhart, I want you to know what you did last Saturday. It was the bravest thing I've seen in a good long while, and I've seen some things." Louisa looked at him carefully. "Some people would call it the most reckless thing," she said. "They're not wrong either," Isaac said. But brave and reckless often look the same from the outside. The difference is in what you're risking and what you're protecting. He paused. You were protecting something, I respect that. He nodded once, replaced his hat, and walked down the porch steps. Louisa stood in the doorway and watched him go and did not try particularly hard to stop herself from watching. Maybelle appeared at her shoulder with the subtlety of a woman who had been in the kitchen and had heard every word. Nice young man, she said mildly. He works for the Verlas, Louisa said, as though that were a response. He does, Maybelle agreed. Eduardo speaks well of him, and Eduardo doesn't speak well of people lightly. She paused. He's been over here twice in a week. Supply orders don't usually come that fast. He brought coffee, Louisa said. He brought an excuse, Maybelle said, not unkindly, and went back to her kitchen. The Saturday visit to the Verla ranch was one of the best days of Louisa's adult life, which she had not anticipated, and which caught her somewhat off guard. Eduardo Verla was a man of 50-something, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, with a face that had been weathered into something that suggested both kindness and the absolute absence of patience for nonsense. He greeted Louisa in the yard of the main house with the particular courtliness of a man who has decided immediately that someone is worth his good manners, and he showed her the ranch with a directness and lack of performance that she found immediately comfortable. Rosa Verla was a small, quick woman of similar age, with dark eyes that missed nothing and a laugh that appeared frequently and without warning. She had been born in Sonora and come north with Eduardo, and had built this home with her own hands in a very literal sense. She took Louisa through the main house and showed her the kitchen garden and the workroom and the particular system by which she organized the household with impressive efficiency, and somewhere in the middle of explaining the chicken schedule, Rosa stopped and said, "Isaac says you are honest like a knife." Louisa blinked. "That's what he said." "He said it was a good thing," Rosa said. "He said a knife is useful." Louisa absorbed this. "That is possibly the most practical compliment I have ever received." "He likes you," Rosa said, with the straightforwardness of a woman who has decided that circling around a thing is a waste of time when you can simply go straight through it. "Mrs. Verla," Louisa began. "Rosa," Rosa said. "Rosa," Louisa accepted. "We have spoken for perhaps 4 hours in total." "Time is different for different things," Rosa said. "Some things take years, some things you know in 1 hour." She turned back to her kitchen garden and began deadheading something with efficient snips. He came home Sunday talking about the wedding and about the woman who stayed honest when everyone expected her not to. And he talked about it the way Eduardo used to talk about land he wanted before he knew he was going to buy it, all around the edges of the thing without ever saying the thing itself. Louisa stood in Rosa Verla's kitchen garden in the April afternoon and felt the sun on her face and heard the distant sounds of cattle and the closer sound of Isaac's voice somewhere beyond the barn, where he was working even on his supposed day off because that was apparently what he did, and she thought, "I am not going to be foolish about this. I am going to be sensible. I am going to be practical and sensible and not build something out of 4 hours and a bag of coffee beans." She managed to hold this sensible position for approximately 6 more days. It broke on a Friday evening when Isaac appeared at Maybelle's just after supper, not with a supply order or a gift of coffee or any excuse at all, and said to Louisa, who had come to the door, "I was wondering if you'd take a walk with me. The creek is good in the evening." She had said yes before she had quite decided to say anything. They walked along Redemption Creek in the dying light, and the water was amber, and the cottonwoods were now fully leafed and made a sound like rain when the wind moved through them. They walked without a destination and arrived eventually at a place where a flat rock jutted out over the water and provided an excellent place to sit, and they sat, and Isaac picked up a stone and turned it in his fingers and said, "Can I ask you something honest?" "You can always ask me something honest," Louisa said. "What are you planning to do?" he said. "I mean long term. You said you were staying in Redemption Creek for the time being. What does that mean?" Louisa looked at the water. The question was reasonable, and she had been asking it of herself and had not arrived at a clear answer. "I don't know yet," she said, which was the true answer. "The laundry and kitchen work at Maybelle's covers my room and board. I have a small amount saved from the millinery. I'm not destitute." She paused. "I've been thinking about whether there might be work as a school teacher." Mr. Finch, the retired school teacher at Maybelle's, says the county school board has been looking for someone since Miss Avery left in January. "Have you taught before?" "I had 2 years of normal school in Missouri before my mother got sick, and I came home to care for her," Louisa said. "I didn't finish my certificate, but Mr. Finch says the board out here is not particularly concerned with certificates when the alternative is no teacher at all." Isaac nodded slowly. "I think you'd be a good teacher." "Why?" "Because you say what you mean," he said. "Children understand that. They're remarkably good at detecting when adults are pretending." "Most adults are remarkably good at pretending," Louisa said. "The question is whether they think it's working." Isaac set his stone down on the rock beside him. He turned to look at her directly, and in the evening light his face was open in a way that she had not seen before, something decided in it. "Louisa," he said, and it was the first time he had used her Christian name, and they both registered the shift. "Isaac," she said, which made him smile. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said, "because I don't know how to be anything else for very long. I've been thinking about you considerably more than is reasonable for someone I've known less than 2 weeks, and I think you probably already know that because you're not a woman who misses things. And I'm not asking for anything. I'm not making a plan or a proposal or any such thing. I just thought, given who you are, you'd rather I say it plainly than go on being mysterious about something that isn't particularly mysterious." Louisa sat with this. She sat with it the way she sat with most things, not rushing to respond but giving it the space to be what it was. "I have been thinking about you considerably more than is reasonable too," she said at last. "And you are correct that I had noticed. And you are also correct that I prefer plain speaking." She paused. "I am not in a position right now to do anything about any of that. I'm standing on ground that shifted under me very recently, and I am still finding my footing. But I want you to know that I hear you, and I don't want you to stop coming around." "I won't stop coming around," Isaac said simply. "Good," Louisa said. They sat by the creek until the stars came out, talking about everything and nothing. And when they walked back to town in the full dark, they walked closer together than they had on the way out, not touching but aware of the space between them in the particular way of two people who are thinking about it. Louisa applied to the Redemption Creek School Board the following Monday. She sat before 3 men who asked her a series of questions that ranged from reasonably intelligent to somewhat condescending, and answered them all fully and accurately. When one of the board members, a heavy-set man named Goodwin who owned the feed store, said that he wondered whether a woman who had caused quite a scene at the church was the right person to be teaching the town's children values, Louisa said that she had not caused a scene. She had said something honest, and that if the board believed honesty was not a value worth teaching children, she would respectfully withdraw her application and let them continue looking. There was a very long pause. The board offered her the position on a probationary basis, with a salary of $32 per month, and Louisa accepted without negotiating, because $32 was a fair amount for 1882 Texas, and she was practical about these things. She started teaching the following Monday. There were 14 students, ranging in age from 6 to 15, in a single schoolroom that smelled of chalk and old wood and the particular energy of children who had been waiting for someone to do something interesting. Louisa assessed them in the first hour, sorted them by ability rather than age, and by the end of the first week had reorganized the curriculum in a way that Mr. Finch, when she described it to him, called unconventional and effective, which she took as precisely the compliment it was intended to be. Isaac came to town every Thursday and every Saturday without fail. He was always ostensibly there for some purpose related to the Verla Ranch, and there was always some genuine purpose related to the Verla Ranch, but no one in Redemption Creek by the second week of May was under any illusion about the primary reason for his visits. They walked. They talked. They had dinner at Maybelle's table with a regularity that made Maybelle's face do a small satisfied thing that she tried to conceal, and mostly failed to. They argued twice about things they genuinely disagreed about. Once about whether the territorial legislature's recent land policies were more harmful or more helpful to small ranchers, and once about whether it was ever honest to withhold information that would hurt someone. And both arguments were conducted with the seriousness of two people who respected each other's reasoning while disagreeing with their conclusions, and ended, both times, with a mutual respect that was, Louisa reflected privately, considerably more intimate than agreement would have been. On the 14th of May, which was a Sunday and therefore a day when the school was closed and Isaac was not expected at the ranch, he arrived at Maybelle's at 9 in the morning with 2 horses saddled. "I want to take you somewhere," he said, "if you're willing." Louisa had been waiting for something without knowing precisely what, and she looked at his face and recognized that this was it. "Let me get my hat," she said. He took her north, up into the hill country above the creek, where the limestone broke through the skin of the earth in great gray shelves, and the cedar and live oak grew thick, and the air smelled of rock and resin and the deep particularity of Texas spring. He took her to a place where the hills opened out onto a long ridge with a view that covered 50 miles of country in every direction, the creek winding silver below, and the town, a small collection of rooftops, and the Verla Ranch visible as a cluster of order and intention among the rolling rangeland. They dismounted and let the horses graze and stood on that ridge in the May morning, and Louisa said, "Did you find this yourself or did someone show you?" "Found it myself," Isaac said. "About 6 months after I came to the Verlas. I used to come up here when I needed to think straight." He paused. "I haven't shown anyone else." Louisa looked at him. "I want to tell you something," Isaac said, "and I want to say it right, so I'm going to think about the words while I'm saying them, which means I might go slow." "Take your time," Louisa said. He turned to face her. The morning light was full and generous, and it showed his face without shadow. "I grew up with a mother who said true things and paid for it," he said. "And I've spent my adult life watching the world reward people who are comfortable and easy and say what people want to hear, and quietly punish the ones who can't quite manage it, and I made a kind of peace with that. I told myself it was how things were, and I just had to find people who were worth knowing and hold on to them." He paused. "The morning you stood up in that church and said what you said, I felt something that I did not expect. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was recognition, like seeing something I had been looking for and not knowing I was looking for it." Louisa stood very still. "I know this has been fast," Isaac said. "I know you have just been through something that would make any sensible person cautious. And I know I am not a wealthy man or an important man, and I have a number of unimpressive things in my past that I've told you about honestly. But I am telling you that I love you, Louisa. Not in the way that is convenient or flattering or arranged, in the way that is just true. The same way you tell the truth, because there is no other way to do it." The wind moved through the live oaks, and the horses moved in the grass, and the whole 50 miles of Texas country spread itself out around them in the May morning, and Louisa thought about all the sensible things she might say, all the careful and considered responses available to a practical and intelligent woman who had been disappointed before and had reasons to be cautious. She reached out and took his hand. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying not to for approximately 3 weeks, and I am not very good at pretending." Isaac Quinn looked at her hand in his, and then at her face, and something changed in his expression. Something that had been held carefully in place by the effort of discipline and hope gave way, and he smiled the fullest smile she had seen from him, and it was a little overwhelming in the best possible way. He kissed her. It was unhurried and completely honest, the way everything about him was, and it tasted like the morning and the open country and the particular sweetness of something arrived at without shortcuts. They stood on that ridge for a long time, talking quietly about everything that mattered. And when the sun reached its midday height, they ate the lunch that Isaac had packed in his saddlebag, bread and dried meat and apples, and drank water from the creek spring that came up through the limestone below the ridge, cold and clear and tasting of stone. "What do we do now?" Louisa asked, and it was not a frightened question. It was a practical one from a practical woman who was very happy and wanted to stay that way. "I'd like to court you properly," Isaac said, "for however long you need. And then when the time is right, I'd like to ask you to marry me, and I'd like very much for you to say yes. And when you ask me," Louisa said, "I want you to ask me knowing exactly who I am, not the useful version of it that I've shown you in good circumstances, all of it." "I already know all of it," Isaac said, "or enough of it to know I'm not going to find anything I can't accept." "That's either very confident or very foolish," Louisa said. "Probably both," he admitted, "but I stand by it." She laughed, and the sound of it went out across the hills, and her horse looked up from its grazing with mild interest and then went back to more important matters. The summer of 1882 in Redemption Creek was the summer that the town reorganized its understanding of Louisa Lockhart. The initial version, the woman who had made a scene at a wedding and left a perfectly decent man standing at the altar, gave way, by degrees, to a more complicated and ultimately more interesting portrait. The schoolchildren, who had no investment in the polite narrative of scandal, simply thought she was the best teacher they had ever had, and since most of them had had exactly two, this was not an impossible standard, but they were right in ways that went beyond comparison. She taught them to read not by drilling, but by finding what each of them cared about and putting a book about it in their hands. She taught arithmetic through practical problems. She had a 15-year-old boy named Colt Rays who had been labeled slow by everyone who had taught him before, and she figured out inside of 2 weeks that he was not slow, but that he thought in pictures rather than in words, and once she showed him how to draw the problem out before solving it, he was faster than anyone else in the room. Colt Rays went home and told his mother that Miss Lockhart had made him feel smart for the first time in his life. His mother told Maybelle. Maybelle told nobody, because she was a good woman, but somehow it got around anyway. By July, the school board's concerns about Louisa's suitability had been replaced by a general civic pride in having her, and Goodwin at the feed store stopped making pointed comments about scenes and started telling people that the school had improved considerably under Miss Lockhart's management, as though this were a thing he had always believed. Isaac came every Thursday and every Saturday without fail, through the hot, flat summer months when the creek ran lower, and the cattle needed moving to better pasture, and the work on the Verla ranch ran from before sunrise to well after sunset. He was sometimes dusty and tired when he arrived in town, and he never pretended otherwise. He brought Louisa books when he passed through larger towns on cattle business. He brought her news from the wider world with honest commentary. He fixed 3 things at Maybelle's boarding house that had needed fixing for months, not because he was asked, but because they were broken and he had the skills. Maybelle watched all of this with the quiet approval of a woman who had seen enough of human nature to know the difference between a person performing goodness and a person who was simply good. "He's a keeper," she told Louisa in early August, with the directness that Louisa had come to think of as Maybelle's particular love language. "I know," Louisa said. "You going to tell him that?" "I tell him regularly," Louisa said. Maybelle raised her eyebrows. "You tell him you love him." "I tell him what I observe about him and what I value," Louisa said, "which amounts to the same thing but with specific evidence." Maybelle shook her head in the fond way she had developed for Louisa's particular brand of thinking. "At some point, Louisa, a person needs to hear the simple words." "He hears them," Louisa said. "I'm not withholding, I'm just thorough." But she thought about Maybelle's comment that evening, sitting on the back porch of the boarding house in the August dark with the sound of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle somewhere east, and she thought about what it meant to be thorough with love as opposed to simply present in it. She thought about how she had always been more comfortable with the evidence of a feeling than the declaration of it, because declarations could be wrong in ways that evidence could not. And she thought that this was, perhaps, the one place where her philosophy of honesty needed adjustment, not in the feeling, but in the willingness to put it plainly. When Isaac came Thursday, she took him out to the porch before Maybelle could produce an excuse to join them, and she said, "I love you. I want you to know I mean that plainly and not just as a conclusion from evidence." He looked at her face in the evening light with an expression that was so openly moved that she had to look away for a moment, not from discomfort but from the sheer force of it. "Louisa," he said. "I know," she said. "No," he said. "I want to say it back. I love you, very plainly." "Very certainly. All right," she said. "All right," he said. They sat together in the August dark, and the crickets were loud, and the stars were enormous and clear, and somewhere an owl made its opinion known, and it was one of the happiest evenings of either of their lives. In September, Eduardo Verla offered Isaac a different position, not as a regular cowhand, subject to the seasonal rhythms of cattle drives and roundups, but as a foreman, responsible for managing the ranch's daily operations and the crew of 8 men who worked the property year-round. It came with a foreman's wage, which was considerably better, and a small house on the property, a 2-room stone house that the previous foreman had built and vacated when he moved on to his own place. Isaac told Louisa about it the following Thursday, sitting in Maybelle's parlor with coffee, and he said it the way he said most things, directly, with all the relevant information included. "That's a significant opportunity," Louisa said. "It is," he agreed. "The house is small, but it's solid." "Good stone construction." Louisa looked at him. "Isaac." "Louisa," he said, "are you telling me about a house because you want me to think about it in conjunction with you?" He set down his coffee cup. "I was going to do this differently," he said. "I was going to wait until I had the right words and the right moment and possibly some kind of plan. But I've been thinking for 3 weeks about the right words, and I keep coming back to the same ones, which are the true ones, so I'm going to use them." He moved to the edge of his chair, which put him closer to her, and took her hands in both of his. "Louisa Lockhart," he said, "you are the most honestly extraordinary person I have ever known, and the prospect of building a life with you is the most compelling thing I have encountered in 29 years of encountering things. Will you marry me?" Knowing that I am offering you a 2-room stone house on a cattle ranch, and a man who has no great fortune but a great deal of love and a consistent policy of honesty. Louisa looked at him for a long moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to see him clearly, fully, the way she believed in seeing things, without the softening that sentiment could sometimes produce. She saw a man of 29 years with work-worn hands and steady eyes and a consistent record, accumulated over 6 months, of being precisely who he said he was. She saw a man who had stayed when every other man had run. She saw a man who had asked her to continue. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will. And I want you to know that I am saying yes to all of it, including the parts that will be difficult and the parts where we will disagree and the parts where a 2-room stone house will feel very small when we have a problem that needs more space than it can offer. Yes to all of it." Isaac Quinn held her hands very tightly and said nothing for a moment, which was itself a kind of eloquence. "Yes to all of it," he repeated softly. "Yes," Louisa said. "Now, will you go speak to Maybelle? She is almost certainly listening at the kitchen door, and I would rather she had something official to direct her considerable energy toward." Isaac laughed, stood, kissed her once firmly, and went to tell Maybelle Hutchins, who was not listening at the kitchen door but was doing something suspiciously close to it, and who received the news with the complete unsurprise of a woman who had seen it coming since the second Thursday. They were married in November of 1882. The ceremony was in the same small white church, officiated by the same Reverend Platt, who approached the occasion with a combination of hope and professional caution that was entirely understandable given his previous experience. The congregation was smaller than Louisa's first wedding had been, and it contained no cowboys who had come for lack of anything better to do. It contained people who had actually come for this, which felt entirely different. Eduardo and Rosa Verla came, Eduardo in his best coat and Rosa in a dark blue dress that she had made herself, and which was beautiful in its simplicity. Maybelle Hutchins sat in the front row with her hands folded and an expression of profound satisfaction. Mr. Finch, the retired schoolteacher, sat beside her, having developed in the intervening months a warm regard for both parties. Colt Reyes sat with his mother near the back, wearing a jacket that was slightly too big and an expression of solemn importance. Hector Brannigan was not there, which was appropriate, but he had sent, through Maybelle, a very correct note wishing them well, and Louisa had written him back an equally correct and genuinely warm reply, and they had arrived, she felt, at the particular peace available to two people who have handled a difficult situation with mutual dignity. Louisa wore her ivory dress again, the one she had made herself, because it was well made and she saw no reason a dress should only be used once for something important when it was perfectly good. She had added a sash of deep copper silk that Maybelle had pressed on her, which was Maybelle's one concession to the decorative. Her hair was down, and she wore no bonnet. Isaac wore a new coat, dark blue, which Rosa had told him to buy and which fit him properly, and he had gotten a haircut. And when he saw Louisa come through the door of the church, he looked at her with an expression so unguarded and complete that Rosa reached over and pressed Eduardo's hand, and Eduardo, who was not a man much given to sentiment, cleared his throat quietly. Reverend Platt asked the question again. Does anyone present know of any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony? The silence was extraordinary, clean and full and completely comfortable. Nobody ran. Isaac took Louisa's hand and the Reverend said the words and they said the words back to him, and the small white church held the warmth of November and the sound of the simple ceremony, and the particular quality of light that comes through plain glass windows on a cold, clear day, honest and unadorned. They ate dinner at Maybelle's afterward, a proper celebration with every boarding-house table pushed together, and Rosa's extraordinary cooking supplementing Maybelle's, and Eduardo made a toast in Spanish that Isaac translated into English, and then Rosa corrected his translation in 3 places, which made everyone laugh, and Maybelle produced a cake that did not lean at all. They moved into the stone house on the Verla Ranch before the end of November. 2 rooms of good solid limestone construction, with a fireplace in the main room that drew properly, and a kitchen corner that Louisa organized within the first afternoon. It was small and it was sufficient, and it smelled of cedar and stone and the good clean air of the hill country, and it felt, more immediately than any place Louisa had ever lived, like home. She continued teaching through that school year, because the school board asked her to and she wanted to, and because the 8 miles between the ranch and town could be managed on horseback in reasonable weather, which Isaac taught her properly in the first weeks after the wedding. She turned out to be a good rider, not elegant but effective, which was precisely on brand. The first winter was hard in the way that first winters in new homes often are, not terrible but full of the small difficulties of learning a space and a life, and another person's, rhythms more intimately than any courtship can prepare you for. They disagreed about the fire at night, Isaac preferring to let it die down and Louisa preferring to maintain it. They disagreed about how early was too early to be up in the morning, Isaac's answer being that there was no such thing, and Louisa's answer being that before 5 o'clock was a philosophical position she was not willing to share. They navigated both disagreements with the same seriousness they brought to everything, and arrived at the compromises that marriages require, and each compromise was in its own way a small act of love. They were also very happy, in the deep and specific way of 2 people who have found each other honestly. Isaac was a thorough and attentive foreman, and the Verla Ranch ran better in his first 6 months in the role than it had in the 2 years prior, not because the previous man had been incompetent, but because Isaac brought to the management of men and cattle the same consistency he brought to everything else. Direct, fair, unsentimental about problems, but deeply committed to solutions. Eduardo Verla watched him manage and said to Rosa privately that he had known, when he met Isaac Quinn 2 years prior, that he would become either a foreman or a ranch owner, and that he was glad it was the former rather than the latter, at least for now. By the spring of 1883, Louisa was pregnant with their first child. She told Isaac on a Thursday evening when the spring was just arriving, and the creek was running high, and the bluebonnets were starting on the south-facing slopes. She told him the way she told everything, directly and without preamble. "I believe I am going to have a baby," she said. "I am quite certain. Mrs. Verla confirmed it yesterday." Isaac was in the process of hanging a new hook beside the front door, and he stopped what he was doing and turned around and looked at her with a stillness that was so complete it was almost alarming. "Are you all right?" was the first thing he said. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I have been feeling not entirely myself in the mornings, but otherwise I am healthy and strong and not the least bit frightened." "I'm frightened," Isaac said simply. "I know," Louisa said. "That's because you love me and you understand that the world is uncertain. It's the correct response. But I am telling you I am fine." He crossed the room and held her very carefully, as though she were something he was afraid to break, and she laughed at him for it and told him she was not breakable, and he said he knew that. He was just extremely invested in the outcome. "You are going to be an extraordinary father," she told him. "How do you know?" he said against her hair. "Because you stayed when everyone else ran," she said. "That's what good fathers do. They stay." He held her tighter at that and said nothing because there was nothing to add. The baby came in the first week of October, 1883, in the stone house with Rosa Verla as midwife and Maybelle Hutchins present for moral support, which she provided with characteristic efficiency. It was a boy, a large and healthy and furiously opinionated boy whom they named Samuel James Quinn, Samuel for Isaac's grandfather and James for Louisa's father. Samuel had his mother's copper hair and his father's dark eyes, and a personality that announced itself within the first week as loud and direct and absolutely certain of its own requirements, which both parents found fitting. Isaac held his son the morning after the birth, sitting in the chair by the fire that they had compromised on, burning at a medium level, and looked at the small, determined face with an expression that Louisa, watching from the bed, would remember for the rest of her life. It was the face of a man who has understood something completely and is standing in the full weight of it. "He's very certain about what he wants," Isaac said. "Gets it from both sides," Louisa said. "That's going to be interesting," Isaac said. "Interesting is the word I'd choose," Louisa agreed. Samuel was, as predicted, interesting. He was walking at 10 months and talking at 12 and asking questions at 13 that required a certain amount of thought before answering, which his mother found delightful, and which sometimes caused his father to sit very still for a moment before responding. He was a ranch child, which meant he was outdoors from the earliest possible age, and grew up with the particular confidence that comes from knowing a piece of land very well, knowing its sounds and its seasons and its dangers and its beauties. Louisa taught at the Redemption Creek School through the spring term of 1884, and then, in the fall, made the decision to stop. Not because anyone asked her to, but because Samuel was almost a year old and the 8-mile ride was harder with a child to consider, and she had come to the conclusion that she could educate her own children and others nearby without requiring the formal arrangement. She went to the school board with this decision, and also with a recommendation for her replacement, a young woman named Clara Ashe who had come to town the previous year, and whom Louisa had been quietly teaching to teach for the past 6 months. The school board accepted both things. Clara Ashe went on to teach at Redemption Creek for 23 more years, and never forgot that Louisa Lockhart had handed her the position with a comprehensive set of notes and a sincere wish for her success. The years moved the way years do in that country, slowly in each individual day and quickly in the aggregate. By 1886, Isaac had saved enough, with Eduardo's encouragement and assistance, to purchase 80 acres of adjacent land, a corner of the Verla property that Eduardo had been wanting to subdivide for some time. They built onto the stone house, adding 2 more rooms, a proper kitchen separated from the main living space, and a porch that ran the length of the south-facing wall and caught the afternoon light in a way that Louisa identified immediately as one of the best things about her life. She had a garden by then, a serious kitchen garden that she tended with the same methodical intensity she brought to everything, and it produced enough to supplement the ranch's provisions considerably. Rosa Verla had taught her things about growing food in the Texas Hill Country that changed what was possible, and Louisa had in turn taken those lessons and pushed them further, experimenting with varieties and timings in a way that Rosa found fascinating and Eduardo found occasionally perplexing. "She is testing the tomatoes," Eduardo told Isaac one afternoon with a tone that was somewhere between admiration and concern. "She tests everything," Isaac said fondly. "It's one of the things about her." "It is a good thing," Eduardo said. "Testing is how you find out what is true." Isaac looked at his employer and friend, and thought that this was possibly the most accurate description of his wife he had ever heard. Their second child came in 1887, a girl they named Ada Rosa Quinn, Ada for no particular person, but because the name had a quality that felt right, and Rosa because Rosa Verla had become the closest thing to a grandmother these children had, and it seemed appropriate to make it official. Ada was quieter than Samuel had been, observant in the particular way of children who are taking everything in before deciding to do anything with it. And she had her father's dark eyes and her father's stillness and her mother's precision. Samuel, who was 4 when Ada arrived, received his sister with the wariness of a child who has not yet worked out whether this development is advantageous, and then, within approximately 2 weeks, with the fierceness of a child who has decided that this small person is his responsibility, and he takes his responsibility seriously. Louisa watched her son with his sister and thought about what Isaac had said about staying when others run. Samuel, at 4 years old, was already a stayer. Hector Brannigan married a woman from Fort Worth in 1885, a widow named Helen who was comfortable and sociable, and who genuinely wanted the things Hector had to offer, and who seemed, when Louisa encountered them at the general store or at church on Sundays, quietly and sincerely content. Louisa felt a clean and unambiguous gladness for him. She had been right that they would have made each other miserable. He had found someone who would not. Maybelle Hutchins remained at her boarding house through the rest of the decade, and became, in all practical senses, the grandmother of the Quinn children. Samuel called her grandmother May, which Maybelle accepted with a dignity that only just concealed how much it pleased her. She came to the ranch for Sunday dinners frequently, and spent those dinners consuming large amounts of whatever Louisa and Rosa between them had produced and offering opinions about everything, which the Quinn household accommodated with the ease of people who believe opinions are welcome at the table. Mr. Finch, the retired schoolteacher, died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1888, and Louisa spoke at his funeral with a brief and honest eulogy that described him accurately as a man who had respected learning enough to spend his life in service to it, which was the truest thing she could say and the most fitting tribute. In the spring of 1889, Isaac came in from the south pasture one afternoon in early May and found Louisa sitting on the south porch in the afternoon light with a letter in her lap, her expression one of the particular stillness she had when she was processing something significant. "What's that?" he said, sitting beside her on the porch bench. "A letter from Mr. Goodwin," she said. "The school board has reorganized and they want me to come back, not as a classroom teacher. They want me to be a school superintendent to oversee the curriculum for the whole county district." She paused. "They're offering a real salary." Isaac looked at the letter, then at his wife's face, which was doing something complicated. "What do you want to do?" he said. This was the thing about Isaac Quinn, the thing that Louisa had known from the beginning and had been confirmed by 7 years of marriage. He asked what she wanted to do, not what she thought she should do, not what would be convenient or proper or expected. What she wanted. "I want to do it," she said. "It's a real thing. It would mean something." "Then do it. It will take time away from the ranch." "Louisa," he said, in the tone he used when she was being modest about things that should not require modesty. "You run this household, you manage the garden that feeds half the county in good conscience, you teach Samuel and Ada every morning before breakfast, and you still find time to help Rosa organize the Verla accounts every month. I think the county school district can fit." "It might mean we need to hire help," she said, "for the house, for when I'm in town." "Then we hire help," he said. "We can afford it now." "You're certain?" He reached over and took the letter from her lap and read it himself, which he did carefully and completely, and then handed it back. "Write to Goodwin," he said. "Tell him yes. Tell him also whatever conditions you need, because I know you have them." Louisa had 3 conditions. She wrote them to Goodwin in precise and unambiguous language. Goodwin accepted all 3 with a rapidity that suggested either wisdom or desperation, possibly both. She became, in the fall of 1889, the first female school superintendent in that county, and quite possibly one of the first in that part of Texas. This was either extraordinary or unremarkable depending on one's point of view, and Louisa herself took the position that it was simply the job, and the point was to do it well, which was the philosophy that had generally served her best. She did it very well. The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are full, not without difficulty or loss or the ordinary heartbreaks that any decade contains, but full of the texture and warmth that come from living honestly and loving honestly, and building something that is genuinely yours. Isaac's 80 acres grew to 240 over the course of the decade, purchased carefully, improved steadily, worked with the same quiet consistency that characterized everything he did. He was not Eduardo Verla, not in scale or in the particular drama of the founding story, but he was building something that was his own, and he was building it well. The Quinn Ranch, as it came to be called in the county, was known for clean operations and fair treatment of the men who worked it, which was partly Isaac's nature and partly the influence of having worked for Eduardo long enough to see what that standard looked like. Eduardo Verla slowed in the early 90s, as men of his age and the labor he had done will slow, and Isaac spent more time helping manage the Verla operation alongside his own, out of friendship and loyalty, and the genuine love that had developed over the years between the 2 families. Rosa Verla and Louisa had become the kind of friends who finish each other's sentences and argue about recipes, and tell each other things they tell nobody else, which is the deepest kind of friendship and the most valuable. Samuel Quinn grew into a young man of considerable character. He had his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, and a quality of physical ease in the outdoors that suggested he had come to the right family for his particular gifts. By 15, he was genuinely useful on the ranch, not in the token way that parents sometimes employ their children, but in the real and productive way of someone who understands the work and can be trusted with it. He had also, to Louisa's particular satisfaction, inherited her appetite for books, and he read everything he could obtain, which in their growing county by the early 90s was considerably more than it had been a decade prior. Ada Quinn was quiet and precise, and had a gift for mathematics that Louisa recognized immediately and treated seriously, providing her with increasingly advanced material and writing to the county school superintendent, who was herself, requesting access to advanced texts, which was a slightly circular arrangement that nonetheless produced good results. Louisa told Isaac when Ada was 10 that the girl had a mind for engineering or accounting or any field that required the management of complex systems, and Isaac said he believed it, and that they ought to make sure she had the education to do whatever she chose with it, and Louisa agreed, and they went about ensuring this with the same practical determination they brought to every project they believed in. In the autumn of 1893, Maybelle Hutchins's health began to decline. It was a gradual thing, a slowing and a softening and a tendency to tire that she managed with characteristic dignity and without complaint, but Louisa saw it clearly and acted. She went to Maybelle and proposed, without asking whether Maybelle needed help because Maybelle would have said she did not, that it would make a great deal of sense for Maybelle to come stay at the Quinn Ranch for the winter, as the boarding house was less busy in winter and could be managed by her part-time assistant, and as the ranch house now had ample room and the south porch was very good for sitting on in the afternoon light. Maybelle said she didn't want to be a bother. Louisa said that Maybelle had been feeding and housing and caring for people for 20 years without calling it a bother, and that it was now someone else's turn, and that the argument was over. Maybelle came for the winter and never went back to the boarding house, which she sold in the spring of 1894 to a young couple who wanted to continue running it, and she lived at the Quinn Ranch for the remaining 4 years of her life. They were good years for her, surrounded by the family that had formed itself around her without anyone exactly planning for it to, with Samuel and Ada competing for the comfortable chair nearest her for the evening reading sessions that became a household institution, and with the particular warmth of being loved by people who had chosen you rather than been assigned to you. She died in the spring of 1898, quietly and without suffering, on the south porch in the afternoon light she had always said was the best thing about the house. Isaac built a small marker for her at the edge of the property, under a live oak that was old enough to have been there before the first settler, and Louisa planted bluebonnets around it every April. By the turn of the century, Redemption Creek had grown considerably. The railroad had come through in 1891, which changed everything the way railroads always changed everything, bringing more people and more commerce and more of the particular noise of a world insisting on its own progress. Louisa had watched the change with the eye of someone who had learned to distinguish between progress that improved people's actual lives and progress that simply moved faster than before. Some of it was genuinely good. The railroad brought books and materials and made the distance between the hill country and the wider world smaller in ways that benefited the children she had spent her career educating. It brought doctors with more recent training and supplies that had previously been months away. Some of it was complicated. It brought pressures on the land and on the people who had been there before the rails, including Eduardo Verla, who spent the early 90s in a series of legal disputes over land surveys and property rights that Isaac helped him navigate, and that Louisa helped him document, spending considerable hours in her superintendent's office writing letters on his behalf with the particular force that her position and her pen could together produce. Eduardo won most of those disputes. He was helped considerably by the fact that his documentation was better than his opponents had anticipated, and his allies more tenacious than they had expected. Isaac turned 40 in 1893, and Louisa organized a celebration with the particular attention to detail that she brought to everything she considered worth doing properly. Eduardo and Rosa came, and the families of the men who worked the Quinn Ranch, and Mr. and Mrs. Goodwin from the school board, who had developed over the years a genuine respect for Louisa that had long since outgrown its origin in their original professional relationship. Colt Reyes came, now 26 years old and running his own small operation south of town, and he brought his young wife and shook Isaac's hand with the manner of a man who knows that certain people deserve to be celebrated and is glad to be able to do the celebrating. Isaac stood on his own south porch in the October afternoon, looking at the people who had gathered for him, and looked at Louisa across the yard, where she was talking to Rosa with the particular animation that came over her when she was discussing something she found genuinely interesting. And he thought about the morning in a small white church when he had leaned against the wall and listened to a woman say the truest possible thing, and decided to stay. He thought, I made one good decision in my life that all the others built from. He thought, I was 29 and I stayed when other men ran. He thought, here is what that decision became. In 1900, Samuel Quinn, 26 years old and the image of both his parents in different proportions depending on the light, married a woman named Elena Vasquez, who was 23, and had come to Redemption Creek from San Antonio to work as a telegraph operator when the station was established in 1896. Elena was dark-eyed and sharp-witted and utterly unintimidated by Louisa, which Louisa identified in approximately the first 10 minutes of their acquaintance as the absolutely correct quality in a daughter-in-law. Samuel had courted Elena for 2 years with the patient thoroughness that was so characteristic of him, and when he proposed he did it in the kitchen of the Quinn Ranch house with his mother present by accident and his father present by design, and Elena said yes before he had finished the question, which made Samuel smile the smile that was entirely his father's. Ada Quinn, at 13, watched her brother's wedding with the expression of someone who is filing all relevant data for future reference. By 1902, Samuel and Elena had a son of their own, a boy they named Joseph Isaac Quinn, and Louisa held her first grandchild on the porch in the afternoon light and felt the particular full circle of it, the copper-haired woman who had stood up at a wedding and told the truth and been left standing in an empty church now holding the evidence of all that had followed. Isaac came out onto the porch and sat beside her and looked at his grandson's small face and said, Joseph Isaac Quinn. He has your eyes, Louisa said. He has your coloring, Isaac said. He has everything, Louisa said simply. Isaac put his arm around her shoulders, careful not to disturb the baby, and she leaned into him with the ease of 15 years of leaning, and the afternoon light on the south porch was exactly as good as it had always been. In 1904, Eduardo Verla died peacefully, in his own home on the ranch he had built from 140 pesos and an absolute clarity of vision. He was 73 years old and had lived a life of such fullness and purpose that the grief of those who loved him was entirely mixed with gratitude that such a man had existed and that they had known him. Isaac stood at his funeral and spoke about him with the kind of honesty that is the highest form of tribute, saying true things rather than comfortable things, and Rosa sat in the front row and nodded at everything he said. Rosa Verla, who had the constitution of someone who had built something from nothing and knew exactly what they were made of, lived another 12 years after her husband. She passed the Verla ranch to their son Marcos, who had been managing it alongside his father for the last decade, and spent her remaining years dividing her time between the Verla house and the Quinn Ranch porch, where she and Louisa continued the conversation they had begun in the kitchen garden in the spring of 1882, adding to it with each year and each season and each new thing that the world produced for them to consider. Isaac Quinn at 50 was a man who had built something real. The ranch was 300 acres by then, run well and run fairly, with 4 permanent hands and a good reputation in the county. His son worked beside him most days, and the particular satisfaction of watching Samuel manage a situation and recognizing his own method reflected back was one of the quiet pleasures of his later years. He was not wealthy in the way of the great ranchers. He was comfortable in the way of a man who has worked hard for something that is genuinely his and has enjoyed the working. Louisa served as school superintendent until 1908, when she decided at 50 that the office could be handed to the next generation of administrators, and that her time was better spent writing. Not fiction, but the practical and educational materials she had been thinking about for 20 years, a series of readers designed for one-room schoolhouses in rural areas, built on the philosophy that children learn best when they are engaged with what they actually care about. She worked on these at the kitchen table in the evenings, while Isaac sat by the fire with a book and the sound of the ranch settling around them, the particular night sounds of the hill country that she had come to know as well as her own pulse. The readers were eventually published by an educational press in Austin in 1911, and they were used in Texas rural schools for the better part of 2 decades. Louisa sent a copy to Colt Reyes, who by then had 3 children of his own attending a school that used her methods, with a note that said, "I have been thinking of you since the first morning, when you showed me what a mind looks like when it finally has the right tools." Colt Reyes kept that note in the frame of his kitchen window for the rest of his life. Ada Quinn grew into a woman of considerable mathematical ability and considerable determination, and she attended a women's college in the East, made possible by the savings her parents had carefully accumulated, and by a scholarship the college offered for academic merit. And she came back to Texas in 1910 with a degree and a clear intention to use it. She established herself in Austin as one of the very few women working in land surveying and title management, a field that required exactly the precision and system thinking she had been demonstrating since she was 6 years old. She visited the ranch regularly and made the South Porch her favorite place in the world, which her parents took as the highest possible compliment. In 1915, Isaac and Louisa Quinn celebrated 33 years of marriage in the way they celebrated most things. Together, on the South Porch, with good coffee and the afternoon light, and the particular satisfaction of 2 people who have chosen well and known they have chosen well, and have built something neither of them could have built alone. Samuel and Alina came with Joseph, now 13, and showing every sign of his grandmother's directness and his grandfather's patience, an unusual combination that promised interesting things. Ada came from Austin with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. Rosa Verla came from the Verla house, 80-something now and slower but no less sharp, and sat in the best chair and told stories about Eduardo that had the whole porch laughing until the evening star came out. The Texas Hill Country in 1915 was not the wilderness it had been in 1882. The county had roads now, and a proper school district, and a bank, and a newspaper, and all the infrastructure of a place that had decided to stay. Redemption Creek itself had grown to a town of nearly 300, which by the standards of that country was a genuine community. Isaac, sitting on his porch in the October evening at 52 years old, surveyed all of it, the ranch and the people and the life, with the same steady eyes that had stayed calm in a small white church in the spring of 1882, while every other man in the building found somewhere else to be. Louisa, 57 now, her copper hair gone to silver with a grace that had surprised her by pleasing her, sat beside him with her coffee and her hand in his and looked out at the same evening. "I was thinking," she said. "You're always thinking," he said fondly. "I was thinking about the morning," she said. "That first morning, the church. I think about it sometimes," he said. "What do you think about it?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was being careful and honest at the same time. "I think about the fact that I was 29 years old and I had no particular plan for my life beyond the next cattle season. And I walked into a church for a wedding that wasn't mine because one of the other hands said there'd be cake. And I heard a woman say something true in a room full of people who didn't want to hear it, and it rearranged something permanent in me." He paused. "I think about the fact that the whole rest of my life was in that room, and I nearly missed it because I was almost late." "You were late," Louisa said. "You had to stand at the back." "I was precisely on time," Isaac said. "I got there exactly when I needed to be there." Louisa looked at him, this man she had loved for 33 years, this steady and true and quietly extraordinary man who had asked her to continue when she had expected no one to ask, and she thought about all the ways that truth had served her, and about the one particular truth she had told in that small white church on a spring morning in 1882 that had set everything in motion. Every man in that room had run. One had stayed and asked her to continue, and she had continued. She had continued for 33 years and intended to continue for 33 more, or however many the world was generous enough to provide. "Isaac," she said. "Louisa," he said, I am very glad you were late." He turned to look at her, and his eyes in the evening light were the same steady dark that they had always been, not changed by 30 years except to have more of themselves in them, more certainty, more kindness, more of the specific quality she had recognized across an empty church and had been recognizing every day since. "I am very glad," he said, "that you said something honest." "I always do," she said. "I know," he said. "It's one of the very best things about you." They sat in the fading evening, on the porch of the house they had built together in the hill country of Texas, in the particular light of an October afternoon in 1915, surrounded by the evidence of a life constructed from truth and sustained by love. And they were at peace, completely and irrevocably, in the way of people who have found the right thing and held on to it without letting go. Inside the house, Joseph was reading a book from his grandmother's collection. In the kitchen, Alina was producing something that smelled extraordinary from whatever she had found in Louisa's garden. Down by the south fence, Samuel was having what looked like a mild debate with one of the ranch hands, using exactly his father's expression and exactly his mother's vocabulary. Rosa Verla had fallen gently asleep in the best chair, her hands folded on her lap, her face entirely at ease. The evening star appeared over the hills. The creek made its sound in the distance, the same sound it had made in 1882 when two people walked along its banks and began the conversation that would become everything. Louisa Lockhart Quinn held her husband's hand on the south porch of their home and let the evening come in around them, full and quiet and entirely good. This was what the truth had built. This was what staying had made. This was what it meant to ask someone to continue, and to have someone continue, through every season and every difficulty and every beautiful ordinary morning of 33 years of honest and extraordinary love. The bluebonnets would come again in April, as they always did, scattered across the south-facing slopes of the hill country in the blue that was almost too blue to be real. And Louisa would ride out to see them as she had every April since she arrived in this country. And Isaac would ride beside her as he had every April since they were married, and they would stand at the edge of the color and look at it together, and the world would be, as it had been, and as it would continue to be, very large and very good. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He rested his cheek against her silver hair. The evening deepened and the stars came out, one by one, and the Quinn ranch sat quietly in the hill country dark, and the south porch was the very best place in the world, and it always had been, and it always would be.